Please silence your devices. Walaikum salam, beloved. Assalamu alaikum. Please have sharp devices. Be mindful that we are live and not to lean on the wall and shut. Let's enjoy. Thank you. If you said it, if you see it.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور انفسنا ومن سيئات اعمالنا واشهد ان لا اله الا الله وحده لا شريك له واشهد ان محمدا عبده ورسوله اما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Brothers and sisters, before we get into the theme of the Qur'an, I ask before the beginning of each Qur'an, that we remember our brothers and sisters throughout this ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu who may be suffering, whether we know the cause of their suffering or not. The suffering may be something that we're doing with our own hands in our homes. And we may be oppressing members of our own families. The suffering may be ignoring those who are in need, regardless of what that need is. It's life-sustaining needs. Perhaps the biggest suffering that is open to everyone's view today is the suffering that's going on in Gaza. That this suffering every day, it seems to reach another level of amazement, how human beings can be so cruel to other human beings. As we gather here for Salat Jumah today, the third holiest site in all of Islam, Masjid al-Aqsa, that because of the Zionist soldiers, the Zionist police today firing tear gas into Masjid al-Aqsa, that no one was allowed to make Salat al-Jumah in the third holiest site in all of Islam today. And so we have very much to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to even come to a relatively safe place to worship our Lord on this Yom Jumah. Unlike so many of our brothers and sisters throughout the world, and particularly today, as we find in Masjid al-Aqsa, when no one was allowed to go in there to pray Salat al-Jumah. Ask that we be aware and make dua for our brothers and sisters in Gaza. As is being reported sometime from last night to early morning today, there were 2 more hospitals that seem to have been targeted by Israeli missiles. That at the hospital, Shifa Hospital, There was a convoy. It's reported that a convoy of ambulances were bringing wounded men, women, and children packed into each one of these cars, this convoy of ambulances, and a missile fell, more than one fell right between, destroying, killing people who were on their way to a hospital, and clearly marked ambulances. That the depth of depravity and how low can we as human beings go in denying just the basic human life, denying just access to food and water, denying access to just convoys of trucks that are waiting to bring supplies, even the fuel to bring whatever is necessary to sustain human life. But yet, our president says that he's not sure about this number of Ghazians who've been killed. No one is questioning the number. If anything, those folks are justifying why they're being murdered and slaughtered the way they are. But this United States president has the unmitigated gall to say, I don't know about those numbers. I don't know. That's just what those Hamas people are saying. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect this ummah. Pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieve the suffering and our brothers and sisters throughout this ummah. It's not just a Palestinian Gazan situation. I'll say this and I'll go on. What we look at too in that holy land of Philistine, what we know too is not just El Aqsa in the West Bank, that the settlers there, the Zionist settlers that have moved and occupied the land of the Palestinian people on the West Bank, that now we find these settlers continuing to terrorize them, just giving a complete full license. Do what you want to do to these people. We'll give you guns, shoot them if you want to. Now, and the last thing I'll say, and I'm making this dua for our brothers and sisters who are suffering, that now the Zionist government is forcing Palestinian Israeli citizens to come to leave the West Bank. Now you go into Gaza and be like the fish being shot in a barrel. Those who are Israeli citizens who've been living in the West Bank that now are being forced. You go into Gaza too. You're Palestinian. You're not a human, as Netanyahu said. You are a human animal. So go over there and be a part of this mass genocide that we're performing for the entire world to see. Brothers and sisters, I'm not going to take much of your time today, but I want to remind myself and remind you what would make an imam, not just here in the community mosque, but what would make an imam, what would make any Muslim brother and sister be so passionate about the land of Palestine? What would cause us to give khutbah, to give lectures, to talk to people, to try to help us understand why this land is of interest? Why are we talking about Yemen all the time? Why are we talking about somewhere in South America? Why are we talking about some lands in some Pacific islands where oppression is going on? I want to just take just a few moments of this khutbah to remind us why Palestine, the land of Philistine, why it is sacred to the Muslims. It ain't just because of Masjid al-Aqsa being the third holiest place in all of this land. It's not just because of that. When we look into the history, the first thing that we recognize that the Prophet Muhammad made this night journey, traveling from outside of the Kaaba, traveling to Jerusalem into the heavens, and then going back to outside the Kaaba in one night. And we say that this Isra is so significant to Muslims because this Khatam Nabiyin was the one leading Salat in Masjid al-Aqsa with so many of the prophets behind him that this last prophet led Salat with other prophets present in Masjid al-Aqsa. We all know this. It's kind of a cardinal article of faith of the Muslims. We know about it, but I just want to remind myself and remind you. There are other reasons why you and I should have this affinity, this love, this connection to this land of Philistine. It's not just because of Israel, the night journey, the going from the Kaaba to Masjid al-Aqsa. It's not by the Prophet Muhammad in one night. It's not just because of that. Brothers and sisters, this land of Philistine that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala references in the Qur'an gives us a kind of connective tissue with those the Nabi, those Rasulullah that came before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu his being the final one. But there were so many other Rasulullah, I just mentioned just a few of them, that recognized and came to and were a part of the landscape for whatever period of time there in Palestine. Brothers and sisters, it is a sacred land that has been declared sacred by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You and I know that this land of Philistine, that this land of Palestine was a land that the Prophet Ibrahim migrated to this land of Philistine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had him as a universal prophet. He was going around with taking the message of La ilaha illallah. He was moving around in one of the lands where the Prophet Ibrahim was giving this dawah, was this land of Palestine. We know even before that the Prophet Nuh, according to prophetic traditions, was saved from punishment after his people just so rejected his message, and he ended up for a time in the land of Palestine. We know that the Prophet Dawood lived in Palestine, in Philistine, and built a huge sanctuary, a huge place of worship there in Palestine. We know that his son, Suleiman, ruled over a great portion of the world with the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ruling from this land of Palestine. We know that the ant that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about, that spoke to the other ants, that Prophet Suleiman heard this ant talking to the other ants. Look out, Suleiman is coming, he may step on us, be careful. We know that this ant that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the Qur'an, in the Qur'an, was in this land of Palestine. There are a number of other things. I'll just mention quickly two others. And this is the Prophet Musa, when he was wandering around and he's trying to take the Bani Israel to the promised land, that the promised land that he was trying to take them into was Philistine, it was Palestine, even though he was not able himself to bring them into Palestine. This is the land that he was taking the people and entering to. And then finally, we know that the Prophet Isa, was born in this land of Palestine. That it's not just a random place on the globe or a random location in the Middle East. That the land of Palestine gives us this connective tissue with so many of the prophets and messengers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised for the guidance of man. So now here, you and I today are seeing the kind of carnage, seeing the kind of murder, seeing the kind of disregard, seeing the kind of human blood watering the soil of this holy land. And if you and I can't find it in our hearts, nowhere, that we just treat it like some of the events that CNN reports, that NBC reports, that we're hear about on the news, if you and I don't feel a connection to this land as it relates to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what the Prophet Muhammad have told us about this land, we need to check something within our hearts because something is wrong. This is a blessed land, that the kind of atrocities that are seldom seen, just so the world can see that these kind of atrocities are taking place in a land that connects all of the faiths, the Abrahamic, all of the monotheistic faiths. They're connected to this little piece of land known as Palestine. Brothers and sisters, if you will allow, I want to just give just a little bit, another dimension about this particular land and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not just given us the names of many of those prophets who were Jewish prophets, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also gives us this kind of connection that the Muslims, after the time of these different prophets, that the relationship that the Muslims, the Muslim leaders had to the Jewish people who were being sometimes exterminated, sometimes just genocide committed against them. So bear with me just for a moment. I just want to share a little of history, because it ain't about hating Jewish people. I'm not saying anything that I'm saying today for that reason. It's about people who are oppressors, people who are denying human beings, people who are slaughtering babies. This is not a condemnation of Jewish people for a second. What this is a condemnation of any human being, Muslim, Christian, or Jew, who can act in this kind of way. But specifically, let me just share some of this relationship that Muslim leaders throughout the history have had with the Jewish people. When we look into the history, you and I read the history of this land, and we get so proud when we hear about Khalid Umar. We read about him, and we read in the prophetic traditions about when it was time that the Muslims were being granted and given the keys of Jerusalem. That Umar was traveling. I don't know if it was, I think it was a horse. I don't think it was a camel. He was traveling on a horse. And he and a servant were traveling together. And the servant was dressed in traditional servant clothes. And Umar is this big, tall, well, the description is like he's 6'8", 6'9", a real towering figure of a man. And Umar comes into approaching Jerusalem. They're expecting the Caliph, because the people of Jerusalem say, we're not going to give the keys to the Muslim, but nobody other than the Caliph, Umar. So when Umar is approaching, it was time for the servant to be riding the horse. And the servant insisted, no, we can't ride, and you get these keys, and I'm riding a horse. I'm your servant, and you have me on the horse. We can't do this. So Omar insisted. So when they got into the, I'm deviating just a little bit from the point of this particular story. But when they got into the city, the people were glad to see him and approached the man on the horse. Oh, Omar, we've been waiting for you to come. You're the one we're giving the keys to the city. And Omar said, no. The servant said, no, I'm not Omar. This is Omar who's walking. This is who you saw in the distance, walking beside the horse that I was riding. That's the nature of this leader that you said you're going to only give the keys to. And so when the Muslims took control over Jerusalem, the history tells us that Omar, with those Jewish people who had been expelled prior to this time, that when this al-Quds, this conquest of Jerusalem took place, that now Omar is entering into the city with a servant riding a horse, and he's walking. But when the Muslims took control over Jerusalem, one of the first acts that Umar ibn al-Khattab, as the caliph, as the second caliph of Islam, what he did was to invite those who had been kicked out before the conquest of Mecca, those Jews who had been kicked out. He welcomed them back into this holy city of Jerusalem. Come on back. Now is the time for justice. It will be just to you. You have been kicked out of so many places, but come under the protection of the Muslims. In the Ottoman Empire, when the Jews were expelled in 1492 from Spain, when the Visigoth Christians retook the totality of the Spanish peninsula from the Muslims in 1492, it was the Ottoman Empire, who at that time were controlling these majority Muslim countries in North Africa, who said to the Jews, come to our countries, come to Morocco, come to Algeria. We find that during this same period of time throughout the Middle East, when the Ottomans controlled the Middle East, key portions of the Middle East, the leaders of these areas, these countries in the Middle East, welcome the Jewish community to come. We will protect you. No one will harm you under the authority of the Muslims. And there are other instances, but in the interest of time, I'll just use these as examples of how, when you hear the narrative, when you hear news commentators say Christians and Muslims have been fighting from the beginning of time, you tell them you're telling a lie. What you're doing, you're twisting the reality of what those Muslims were ruling by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed to his Prophet Muhammad and the actions of the Prophet Muhammad. You're telling a lie, because history bears out that the Muslims were not in this hostile relationship just because people were Jewish by birth. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. All praise is due to Allah. We praise Him and seek His assistance and His protection against the evils of our minds and against the unsuccessfulness of our actions. Whomsoever Allah guides, no one can lead astray. And whomsoever Allah allows to go astray as a result of their own actions, no one can lead aright. O Allah, help those who help the religion from opponents or Salat and countless amongst them. O Allah, disappoint those who try to disgrace the religion of Muhammad and do not make us of those. Brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving all believers a very, very simple command. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Qiyamah, on the day of judgment, part of our evaluation as to what did we do during the time that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us here on earth will be how did we discharge this responsibility from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to stand up for justice. Not just stand up for justice when it's convenient in our houses, talking big smack, talking that noise when we're behind closed doors. We want to impress our children, impress our wives about how much we know about situations and how there's so much for justice. Then outside of our doors, we act like our mouths are sealed, that our legs can't move, that we can't do anything to speak out injustice. Brothers and sisters, all over the world, Muslims and non-Muslims are gathering by the thousands and gathering by the millions, protesting what is going on in Gaza today. And amongst those groups, there's so many people who identify as being Jews, they're Jewish, that they may be following the guidance that has been given to the Jewish people through their prophets. But they, so many of them, are not supporting and standing up and protesting and going into the U.S. Capitol and standing and protesting and being carried out or ushered out, that they're showing a courage that I only wish that I had that kind of courage in my heart. That they are saying that we don't care who we are. We don't care who you are. We don't care. This is something that is against just humanity. So take a stand. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, during times like this, there's no time for us to be silent on our jobs, to be silent in our circles of friends, to not speak out when we have the opportunity to help educate people about what's actually going on. Tell them to stop looking at CNN. Tell them to stop listening to MSNBC. Tell them to stop listening to the lies and the slander that these commentators are saying against the Muslims and saying against those who are being oppressed and have been oppressed for 75 years. You and I have the responsibility to stand out firmly for justice, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamina bil qisti shuhada lillahi. That, oh, you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah. And the ayah goes on. That this is a cardinal principle of faith for men, women, and children old enough to understand what this deen is all about. Don't be silent. Don't be afraid. I'm not saying it's our responsibility to go downtown and Courtney Plaza and just stand on the busy streets downtown and just preach to the people. This is not what I'm saying. But if we first hate boom, oppression in our heart, then we'll find the means, we'll find the way that is appropriate for each and every one of us to take a stand for justice. No one's telling us to try to slip into Gaza and join Hamas. It's not what I'm saying. taking a stand for justice, you find that lover that you are comfortable with. Everybody's not going to be a Khalid ibn Walid. Everybody's not going to be a Salahuddin Ayyubi. Everybody is not going to be the glorious sisters who fought protecting the Prophet Muhammad at the Battle of Uhud, who were out on the battlefields tending to the Muslims as they were falling on the battlefield. Everybody's not going to have the courage to do that. So find your level of confidence. The theme of the Khutbah today is to do something. Don't just act like what we're seeing in front of our eyes today is not one of the grossest expression of inhumanity of the 21st century. If not the worst, it's one of the worst. It's way up there on the list. So don't just pretend this is another just news item or listening to these idiots on cable TV talk about, oh, they've been fighting from the beginning of time. Don't go for this nonsense. The truth is too easy to determine. Door, Allah, give us an understanding of this theme that is useful for us in this world and in the next. Oh Allah, strengthen our faith and our ability to take a stand for your cause. And oh Allah, make not this ummah of the Prophet Muhammad an object of test for the disbelieving people. Brothers, I have a few quick announcements. The first one is to encourage each and every one of you